Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's video, I'd like to talk about the relationship between Moses and Plato, between the Pentateuch and the writings of the philosopher Plato. Before I do so, just for anyone watching right now, if you could give me a thumbs up in the chat if the sound is okay. Like that, I can make sure I don't record an entire video without any sound. Thank you very much. Okay, well, we're going to be looking at the writings of two thinkers, um, specifically the writings of Joseph Ratzinger, his book that I have right here, Eschatology, Death and Eternal Life. But the section that we'll be reading from is actually heavily influenced by Joseph Pieper. Joseph Pieper is also a German philosopher. What Ratzinger's more of a theologian, Pieper's more of a philosopher, and Pieper has written a lot of amazing short books on little snippets of Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Augustine. Pieper is a phenomenal writer and philosopher. I strongly recommend anybody out there, if you can find just one of his books, get it, read it. They're all very short. They're easy to understand. They might give you a little bit of a struggle here and there, but it's worth struggling with those books because they are very profound and very rich. So I strongly recommend Pieper. But here we're going to read from Ratzinger's book, and of course he's drawing from Pieper in some of the areas that we'll cover. Now, that being said, just a reminder to the audience, if you're listening to this and the sound is okay, please give me a thumbs up in the chat box. Like that, I can make sure that this recording doesn't go to waste. Okay, that being said, we're going to dive into this text. I have a lot of things I want to talk about. I probably won't be able to talk about all of it, so we'll probably do a part 2. But this stuff is exciting. I love this stuff. So I'm going to put the links in the show notes for these books. I'm going to refer to this one, of course. The main reading is going to come from this one. And this book right here, very little book by Joseph Pieper called Divine Madness, Plato's Case Against Secular Humanism. So good. This is like $10. Buy it. It's so good. Read it. Okay. So before we get into the text, which I'm going to pull up on the screen, I want to give the context of the text that we're going to read. And the context is basically the theology of death. Oh my. So Ratzinger kind of gives two observations. I'm going to gloss over them real quick because here I'm just giving you the context. But the first observation is that bourgeois society today hides death away. And here he even mentions Joseph Pieper, and he says Joseph Pieper has made a collection of a number of significant variations on this theme. So again, referring to Pieper. But the other thing he says is not only this hiding away of death, but almost a glamorizing of death. And here he explains himself. He writes, Schleiermacher once spoke of birth and death as, quote, hewed out perspectives, end quote, through which man peers into the infinite. But the infinite calls his ordinary lifestyle into question. And therefore, understandably, humankind puts it to the ban, puts the infinite to the ban. The repression of death is so much easier when death has been naturalized. Death must become so object-like, so ordinary, so public, that no remnant of the metaphysical question is left within it. Just think of the way death is dealt with in entertainment, for example, right? He also talks about like the technologizing away of death, right? And the relationship with euthanasia. Very amazing section here in his book, but we're not going to talk about that today. I just wanted to give you the context before we get into the text that I want to read with you guys, because this stuff, like I said, is so interesting. And again, the title of the video says it all. We're going to look at the relationship between Moses, so particularly the Pentateuch, right, and Plato and his writing, so his dialogues, the most famous one, and I think the best one, the Republic, right? But you have the Apology, Crito, Phaedrus, all of these incredible works of philosophy. The Symposium, one of my all-time favorites. So, without further ado, let's do that. I'm going to put this down and I'm going to share my screen here. Again, if you're watching, just give me a thumbs up in the chat box so I'm sure that everything is going well. I think everything's fine. Someone would have probably complained by now. Okay, so go ahead and share my screen. All right, we're going to read through this together. Now, before we do this, this is from Joseph Ratzinger's book, Eschatology, Death and Eternal Life. It is an incredible book. Okay, sound is great. Awesome, thank you. This book is phenomenal. Um, it's it's difficult. Okay, it's I think probably the most difficult thing that Ratzinger's written, but it's so rewarding. Um, I have developed a pet peeve thanks to this book, and this is why I'm doing this video. The pet peeve is the bad mouthing of Plato that I hear all the time amongst theologians, right? Of course, this is in vogue in Protestant theology, especially, right? I think Catholic, specifically Catholic biblical theology, don't really know what to do with Plato, so kind of avoid the question, right? And of course, Ratzinger tackles it head on. But let's get some context into this animosity towards Plato and why it's relevant and what's at stake here. Okay, so let's dive right into this text and read it together. So Ratzinger begins this section 2 here, the historical roots of the question. He often does it this way. He asks a question, he kind of lays out the lay of the land, the state of a question. Okay, so he's going to talk about the prevailing view. So just to make things clear here, excuse me, I just ate a late lunch. So, okay, to make this clear, Ratzinger is about to lay out not his own position, but the popular position on Plato. Not just Plato, but on the relationship between the Hebrew and the Greek. This is going to be the popular layout. In fact, I should have grabbed it. It's over in front of me on the other table. But N.T. Wright's book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, is very heavily influenced by this popular view. In fact, it's it's become frustrating when I read N.T. Wright's. Okay, all right. So let's go ahead and just read what he says. So Ratzinger writes, since the positivist and materialist answers leave us finally perplexed at this crucial juncture, it should be clear that the issue of life and death are not among those which progress in the exact sciences can clarify. So, remember, I started with the context. We're jumping in the middle of an argument here, right? What he's saying is that, um, you know, technologizing away death or naturalizing it or trivializing it or hiding it, right? Just is an evasion of the question that death raises, which is the question of the meaning of our lives. If death is meaningless, then it means that our lives are meaningless. And so that's why avoiding death is not an answer, but avoiding the question. And so here he's saying we need to look somewhere else than merely in the exact sciences and their progress to answer the question of death, right? We need to look at these basic human questions. So, with that context continuing, he writes, there is a set of questions, the really human questions, where other approaches towards an answer must be brought in. In this respect, the experience comprised in the wisdom of the tradition remains of central importance. And yet, if one seeks counsel here from the theologians, who are the professional guardians of tradition in Christianity, one discovers, by and large, a somewhat depressing state of affairs. So, he's going to lay out this depressing state of affairs. Okay. In recent discussion, one can identify two phases which are distinct, though they cannot be separated chronologically in any watertight fashion. The first tendency is particularly well represented by the works of P. Althaus and E. Jungle. I'm not sure how you pronounce the second name, but these are two German Lutheran theologians. Um, I did a little bit of research on Althaus, and he was actually kind of not, kind of non spectacular, kind of forgotten but was popular and influential at his time. Um, so he's going to lay out what these guys had to say. Here it goes. It is based on that antithesis between biblical and Greek thought, which, since the 16th century, has increasingly stamped itself on theological work. So far as our question is concerned, the application of this rather schematic contrast has it that the Greek understanding of death, decisively shaped by Plato, was idealistic and dualistic. Matter was looked upon as in itself a bad thing. Only spirit and idea count as genuinely positive, godlike, the really real. On this view, man is a strange creature in which the two contrary realities of matter and spirit have come to coincide. The being thus molded is self contradictory, fatal, right? This is why we die. There's this separation between them, right? Death being that kind of violent separation. He continues, and again, he's laying out the popular view here. The divine flame of the spirit is imprisoned in the dungeon of the body. The way of the wise man, accordingly, is to treat the body as the tomb of the soul, and to prepare himself for immortality through such enmity to the prison house. What is he talking about here? So this is me here. I'm taking a step away from the text real quick. Let's actually want to reread that sentence because it's important. He says, the way of the wise man, accordingly, is to treat the body as the tomb of the soul and to prepare himself for immortality through such enmity to the prison house. What he's talking about here is asceticism, right? A form of asceticism that is looked down upon, right? And rightfully so, right? This idea that like because the body is not me, but it's the source of my problems, I have to become more spiritual. So I have to free myself from the body. Well, what is holding me back? What is imprisoning me when it comes to my body? Well, it's my desires, my appetites, my emotions, the mess that it is to be alive in this world biologically, right? Death, sickness, all these things. That's the bad stuff, right? And I got to get away from that into the spiritual so I can be free from this prison. So this form of asceticism is a very anti-body kind of asceticism that you find in Gnosticism or Manichaeanism, right? All that is not Catholic, even though I do know a lot of Catholics who think this way. Anyway, so so far the Protestants, this popular view here is popular amongst Protestants, right? That Ratzinger's laying out. So far, it sounds pretty good, though. I mean, he's basically rejecting this view that is Platonic, and I mean, it sounds like we can get on board with that. So let's continue and hear out Ratzinger about this popular view. He writes, "Death, then, is the great moment when the gates of that prison house are flung wide open, and the soul steps forth into that freedom and immortality which are its by right. Death is man's true friend, his liberator from the unnatural chains of matter. Socrates, as presented by Plato, is an exponent of this idealist interpretation of death. He celebrates his own dying as a festal journey from the sickness of bodily life to the health of true living. At the moment of death, he asks that a cock be sacrificed to Aesculapius, I think that's how you pronounce it, the customary sacrifice offered in gratitude for a recovery. Death here is interpreted as emergence from the diseased semblance of life, which is this world, into real and lasting health. Let me reread that sentence. I put the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Death here is interpreted as emergence from the diseased semblance of life, which is this world, into real and lasting health. So that's the Plato that people think. That's what people think Plato teaches. I mean, come on. Who has not heard this version of Plato? And I mean, you know, this is the version of Plato that I've always heard of growing up. Um, and even even in my studies, like today, like when I was studying as an undergraduate, um, and and even like when I talk to other theologians, like this is a view of Plato that's very popular. Um, it's not correct, and we'll look at it more closely. Of course, there's half truths and stuff, but let me check. Okay, let's continue. All right, continuing with the text here. At this point, we get our first glimpse of a conclusion which in recent years has become of great importance for Christian faith and preaching. Some people are saying that belief in immortality belongs to this dualistic, body hating Platonist thinking and has nothing whatever to do with the ideas of Scripture. In biblical thoughts, by contrast, man is seen in his undivided wholeness and unity as God's creature and cannot be sliced down the middle into body and soul. This is why the biblical authors do not submit death to an idealistic transfiguration in their descriptions of it, but present it rather in its full, unvarnished reality as the destroying enemy of life. Only Jesus' resurrection brings new hope. However, this hope is no way, sorry, however, this hope in no way softens the stark reality of death, in which not the body alone, but the entire human being dies. Language itself indicates this truth, for we say, I will die, not my body will die. You can't get away from the totality of death. It devours you, leaving nothing behind. True, the risen Christ gives us the hope that, by God's grace, the entire person will be raised again into newness of life. This biblical hope, expressed only in the term resurrection, presupposes the finality of death. The immortality of the soul must be firmly rejected as an idea which goes against the grain of biblical thought. Okay, and he ends this section here with, we shall return in some detail to the question of immortality in a moment. The prior question facing us now is how death itself is to be interpreted. So, this is a good juncture here to comment. So, everything I have read so far is the popular view of Plato and the popular view of the relationship between Greek thought and Hebrew thought, between philosophy and the Bible, between Greek philosophy and the Bible. And so I guess what's interesting is that I used to believe this, you know, and well, I kind of came to it, I came to that conclusion that this layout I just presented was true, precisely through reading N.T. Wright. And N.T. Wright is strongly influenced by Oscar Coleman, and a lot of a lot of this Greek versus Hebrew um, dichotomy. There's a lot of that in him, and so I think it's important to remember that N.T. Wright, of course, is Protestant. So once I had come to the conclusion that this view of Plato is accurate because I've heard it before, right? And that therefore the Hebrew, right, which is the undivided human person, there's no body soul dualism. And then the Greek, which is body soul dualism, matter bad, body prison, soul flies out into liberation. Well, I came to the obvious conclusion that the Greek and the Hebrew are not compatible. But here's the dilemma. If that's the case, what do I do with the church fathers? And not just that, what do I do with some of the books in the Deuterocanon, like Wisdom of Solomon? There's some very clear dualistic talk of body soul, right? in the deuterocanonical books. There is a very clear Greek influence on the deuterocanonical books. So in a certain sense, what we see here is that some Protestants have an internally consistent understanding of the canon, at least when it comes to the fact that the Hebrew is pristine, it's the untampered with original, and all that Hellenization, all that Greek talk that comes with Nicaea, that comes with the diaspora, that comes with the Septuagint, right? And therefore the deuterocanonical texts, all that is corruption. Let's get back to the Hebrew Bible and the 27 books of the New Testament. But you see, you start peeling back this onion, and then you realize that John is making reference to the logos of Greek philosophy. He doesn't lift it from Greek philosophy and keep it the way it is. He transforms it, of course. But then you have Paul, who makes reference to Stoic philosophy. And so it becomes very arbitrary. And then this peeling away uh, becomes a slippery slope. And then you're left with an apostasy, at the beginning of the church, and restoration of the Jewish pristine faith with Martin Luther, who abhorred philosophy. But he also had a kind of Marcionite view of the relationship between the old and new, because Luther was not very nice to the Jewish people, and he saw the Old Testament as like, all of these, almost like an affirmation of how bad we are, and that it's nothing we can do. It's not about law, but it's about grace and what God does. This radical extrinsicism between nature and grace, but also between justification and nature, between old and new. But that's a tangent. Okay, bringing things back. So this is the context, right? We have Plato seen as this idealistic, rationalistic, individualist, matter-hating dualist. Okay, and then we got the Hebrew no dualism, the unity of man. When he dies, it's basically total death. You might say annihilation, but the immortality of the soul is not part of the Bible. It's not part of the Jewish heritage. It's not part of Aboriginal Christianity. And then the only hope of the Christian is resurrection. And resurrection is just a bringing back of the whole man after death, after annihilation. He comes back, right? Because of Christ. And so you have a discontinuity between death and resurrection, a kind of destruction, annihilation and new creation. So you can see how this could map on to some of the texts in the New Testament. But you see how this dichotomy is problematic. So let's continue reading Ratzinger here. He's going to challenge this. But before doing so, I think he's going to continue with this presentation. Yeah, he is, of the popular position here. So continuing with Ratzinger. In certain segments of contemporary theological literature, the thesis of total death has undergone such a radicalization that its biblical aspect is visibly stripped away. So what he's saying here is that, as we've talked about, total death is like the consequence. If there's no dualism, then when man dies, he dies. Like he's no longer there. Like bye, right? But if you take that so far as to say this kind of radical destruction and annihilation and disappearance of the person, it actually seems to go against quite some available biblical evidence. So it's a contrived interpretation, is what he's saying. Now, he has a footnote, and if you go to the footnote, he gives references, but we don't have time to get into those, so we're just going to keep going. Okay. In a thoroughgoing fashion, writers take over that archaizing view of the Old Testament once found among the Sadducees and claim that the Jewish scriptures in themselves know nothing of either immortality or resurrection. These ideas, it is insinuated, are invoked only in a marginal way, on loan from Iranian thought. Let's stop right there. You see what he's saying is that these people who take this total death thesis and this no immortality of the soul thesis, right, account for those biblical passages that do seem to hint at it, by claiming that they're just extra biblical influences from Iranian thought. And so, you know, that's why, in a certain sense, they're looking at the Pentateuch in the way that the Sadducees would be looking at the Pentateuch. Um, yeah. So here he talks about this ad hoc reconstruction of scholars a little bit more. He says, congruently with this, some authors insist on isolating Q, the reconstructed sayings source lying behind Matthew and Luke, as the original form of a quote Christianity before Christ, end quote. Here, not only the theme of the church, but also that of death and resurrection, sacrifice and atonement are conspicuous by their absence. So what he's saying here is that Q, right? So the two source hypothesis is that Matthew and Luke were written uh, 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 with the Gospel of Mark as a source, and a collection of sayings by Jesus as another source, which we call Q. We don't have Q, but what we do is you cross reference Matthew and Luke, and you see where there's overlaps that are not found in Mark, right? And that kind of gives you a hypothetical Q. Now, I'm not I think Q is actually plausible. Like I this is a kind of personal kind of tangent here, but I do think, okay, I'm open-minded. I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, but I am definitely someone who sees Markan priority as much more convincing than anything else I've seen so far. So if you guys are interested in that debate about the synoptic problem, I think Markan priority and a Q source makes a lot of sense to me. So that's so I don't want to denigrate and he's not either, because Ratzinger actually thinks the same. But it's a lot more complicated. It's almost like one of those questions which is like beside the point, because Ratzinger talks about the ecclesial process um, of the writing of Scripture, and uh, particularly with the Gospel of John. Right? He doesn't deny like authorship. He just has a richer understanding of authorship that's less anachronistic and modern. We think of authorship as like this, because we see it through these like lenses of this modern view of like it's one author, he's writing down facts, and there's like this fact value distinction. He's doing history in a scientific way, and it's just like so anachronistic. But anyway, that was another tangent. I apologize. Again, I'm not denying authorship. I totally affirm the apostolic origins and authenticity of all these wonderful and inspired and inerrant books. Okay, that being said, so he's saying here that Q is basically this total death, no resurrection, no dualism, no immortality source, right? And then Christ is like added on top of that, in the sense of atonement and resurrection, and therefore immortality, and therefore church, and all that stuff, right? And um, so I mean, it's basically, this is a pretty insane theory, because it's claiming that obviously, this is a whole different conversation, but that the Christ of faith is not the same as the Jesus of history. But that's another conversation. Let's continue the text here. Here, not only the theme of the church, I already read that. Okay. Only on such an approach, it is said, can the total death of each human being retain that irrevocable finality which is proper to it. Resurrection becomes a mere cipher whose content mutates according to the philosophical convictions of the writers concerned. So here's saying basically that resurrection, what it means, because we'll talk about that probably in a different video, but what resurrection means depends on which scholar is interpreting the texts, right? And so this total death theory kind of provides this blank canvas upon which you can paint your own version of resurrection, right? So resurrection becomes a mere cipher whose content mutates according to the philosophical convictions of the writers concerned. Such views are not without a certain inner consistency. A resurrection juxtaposed with total death in an immediate and unconnected manner does become a fantastic sort of miracle, unsupported by any coherent anthropological vision. So he's saying because of this kind of total death, you do have a blank canvas, right? You kind of have a blank anthropological playing ground. That's a weird way to think of it, if that makes sense, though. Okay. The suggestive power of this new view of things derives from the perfect correspondence between the most advanced demands of the spirit of the age, on the one hand, and on the other, the biblical message, as suitably doctored by source critical manipulation. So, what he's saying is that this schema, right, is actually pretty powerful when it comes to speaking to people nowadays because it combines both this kind of radical materialism, right, of the human being, right? Like he dies, he's gone, nothing after it, right? It's this radical reductive materialism. And then also, the methods of modern scholarship that want to peel the onion back until there's nothing left, right? And so, while holding on to faith in the resurrection, it's very convenient if you see what he's saying here. Okay, he continues. However, this also means that faith abdicates its responsibility of offering an authoritative response to man's ultimate questions. Faith here simply points to the general experience of absence of meaning as to its own final comment on the human situation. But for such an office, faith is superfluous anyhow. So here, faith is just unable to actually help because it just becomes a scientific theory and it becomes fantastical and it becomes detached from not just history and scripture, but even nature, right? So this kind of radical separation uh, makes faith irrelevant. Okay, so we are going to get into the answer of Joseph Ratzinger. Let me check the group chat and see what's going on there. Okay, we'll just keep reading. All right, so that is the lay of the land. Let me just reiterate one last time, and then we'll get into his answer, which is really incredible. There's so much I want to get into that I can't because I'm going to get worn out in a bit here. But so he's saying here's the popular view out there, and it's very popular in Protestant exegesis because of its foundations in the Reformation. You have the Hebrew pristine vision of anthropology and salvation, history, right? Salvation history, right? Which is man is not dualistic, right? He's one whole man, one person, right? His body is himself. And um, so that means that when he dies, like, that's it. He's gone. He's dead. That's death. Death doesn't apply just to the body and not the soul because there is no body soul dualism. Man dies, he's gone. What Jesus brings is this hope that even though you went bye bye, you're going to come back, right? I'll bring you back. Um, which is already kind of contradictory because that implies that something's being brought back, but it's been annihilated. So anyway, okay. The point though ultimately is that um a resurrection is kind of like this very this rupture with the status quo, almost with logic, it seems to me, right? That it brings about something so foreign to nature that it becomes irrelevant. Anyway, the point being that's the Jewish view according to these people. Then Plato, and here this is really what I want to say. The thing with Plato is that everyone thinks of him as someone who hates the body, right? And who thinks the body is sickness itself, it's a cancer, it's a prison. And I don't blame them for saying this because a lot of the language when you read the dialogues does sound like this, but there's so much more going on. Anyway, and so therefore, Plato is an individualist, right? An idealist and a rationalist, right? He wants to escape through the mind, through thinking, through idea, right? Into the spiritual, away from the body, away from the multiplicity of the material, right? And into the unity of the. It's very simple. It's basically a view that is actually accurate with Gnosticism. So this view of Plato does fit Gnosticism. There's probably more to it than that, but okay. So, what is Ratzinger's response to these caricatures? And so here's his response: an attempt at revisionism. If, for the sake of scientific objectivity, one tries to take a closer look at the historical data, the following picture emerges. First of all, the contrasting of cultures and thought forms as though these were fixed quantities, in this case, Greek versus biblical, makes no historical sense. Period. I want to stop right there. This is kind of obvious. It's funny because I had never thought about that, but it's just so obvious, which is like this is such a, again, an anachronistic modern rationalist in post enlightenment way of thinking of things, where we think that cultures are quantifiable and like reducible to some kind of scientifically objective criteria. Like it's so much more than that. It's so much more dynamic. It's so much more complex, and it involves genuine relationships and living out the values, not just truth propositions of a philosophical system, but a way of living and of relating, right? That's um that is more than just this kind of reduced propositional way of thinking, which is in fact a lot like what the sophists were doing, and Plato was against the sophists. But I think David Schindler calls this misology. I have to double check that. But I think he calls it misology, which is like this reduction of truth to this kind of rationalist system. Anyway, so he says here, first of all, the contrasting of cultures and thought forms as though these were fixed quantities, in this case, Greek versus biblical, makes no historical sense. Great cultures and the thinking which grows up on their soil are not static formations with settled boundaries. The grandeur of a culture is manifested in its capacity for reception, for permitting itself to be enriched and transformed. A truly great culture does not enclose itself hermetically in its own sphere, like a capsule. Rather, does it carry within itself a dynamic capacity to grow, for which the interplay of giving and receiving is an essential condition. So there's so much more about this that I could say, but it would take us on a massive tangent. I guess I'll just say one thing. um, Joseph Ratzinger's theology of culture is so good. You know what? I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to point you to one book among many, two books actually. These two books here. Um, actually, mostly this one, right? Truth and Tolerance, but also A Turning Point for Europe? Question mark. These are both really good. So I won't go down this tangent, but the point is taken. Let's continue. With respect to our theme, this means that in the face of the question of death, all cultures and milieu of intellectual reflection have been subject to change. I mean, again, this is one of those things that's like obvious, and I don't know why I hadn't thought about it when I was reading N.T. Wright, which is like there's no such thing as like this one Greek culture that you can like delineate and doesn't change, and it's like this propositional system about this kind of individualist spiritualism that hates matter. Like that's just nonsensical, really. There can be like themes in its history, but it's not static. It's so much richer and interacts. I mean, just think of the Old Testament, right? I mean, the influence of Egyptian wisdom literature on the Book of Proverbs, uh, one example among many, right? Okay, he continues. The individual phases of this process show certain marked similarities. Originally, all cultures. So here he's going to do a kind of genealogy thing. I love this. Originally, all cultures found shelter in the very structure of the cycle of life and death, a shelter which myth built for their repose. Let's start right there. So, originally, all cultures. So, he's saying like humanity across the board in history, if you look at all these different cultures, right? When it comes to the topic of death, which isn't kind of existentially troubling reality, to say the least, right? And therefore, consequently, the topic of life and its meaning, right, in reference to death. Um, we need to find some kind of shelter to deal with that kind of anxiety, right? So all cultures found shelter in the very structure of the cycle, right? So they had this understanding of the cycle. He is going to explain how children feature importantly here because you continue to live and survive in your children, right? But the cycle of life and death, right? And they find a shelter in myth and the myth that's built for the repose of this cycle, right? And just think of all the myths, right? All the kind of myths of fertility, of recurrence, creation myths, the great Greek myths, all that stuff, right? So that's where they find meaning, right? This kind of existential, religious, even psychological uh, meaning. So, uh, Ratzinger continues. They knew a contended. Sorry, what? They knew a contended this worldliness. Oh, okay. They knew a contented this worldliness. Right. So they were content. Sorry, I had a trouble reading that for some reason. So they knew a contented this worldliness, a desire for fulfillment in the richness of long life, and continued existence in one's children and their posterity. So that's the initial phase he wants to talk about. This kind of they deal with death and life through myth, and they are content in being part of the cycle, and their children continue. And there's kind of idyllic, you know, phase here a little bit, right? And he continues, this is not just how things were seen in the Old Testament world in uh, yeah, this is not just how things were seen in the Old Testament world in early times. It is just as much true of the early Hellenes, so the Greeks, right? Achilles, after all, preferred the life of a beggar in this world to being sovereign of the shades, whose life is hardly a life at all. And this description also applies to the early period of that most spiritual of all cultures, India. I should add that nowhere is death conceived as being absolutely the end. So that's the first thing, right? Like this constructed schema of these exegetes who think they're so clever. Anyway, sorry. This could it just flies in the face of like the experience of all of these incredibly rich cultures that have come before us. It's so conceited. Some of modern enlightenment can be so conceited. Okay. Um, I should add that nowhere is death conceived as being absolutely the end. Everywhere some kind of subsequent existence is assumed. Complete nothingness was not even thinkable. This afterlife, which is not life, but a curious mixture of being and nothingness, on the one hand, was rendered possible by rites of passage, with their provision of food for the dead, and on the other was in itself an object of great fear. So, yeah, there's like this ambivalence towards life after death, right? Like no one's ever believed that it was this complete annihilation, and yet no one's believed that like resurrection or something like that, right? Like it was this kind of world of the shades, right? There was like this mixture between being and nothingness. How does he put it here? Yeah, mixture of being and nothingness is how he writes it here. He gets into this later on in such a fascinating way. But okay, um, let's continue here. He says, the dead and the nothingness they carry might break through into the sphere of life. So there's a danger, a fear of death, right? And here I'm thinking of the whole logic behind Leviticus. So he writes, thus, rights on behalf of the dead are also apotropaic rights, which protect life by sealing the departed into their own realm. So I'll explain what that fancy word means in just a second. But what's cool is that like it's both this aid to those who depart, and there's a sadness, right? There's like this, we hope we hope that your journey beyond the grave like goes well, right? But at the same time, there's a fear. Everyone fears death, so there's like this. We seal them off, like they're dead. All right, we got to make sure that that thing, death, that happened right there doesn't seep into life. That's what sickness is, right? That's why there's this association, especially in Leviticus, right? With bodily fluids and like impurity, ritual impurity, and how you have to be ritually pure to be in the service of God, who is life itself. So much stuff going on there. It's so cool. But yeah, so apotropaic, that is like it's a Greek word that I think just means to keep evil at bay, right? So thus, rights on behalf of the dead are also rights that keep evil at bay, which protect life on this side of the veil by sealing the departed into their own realm. It's just so fascinating, right? So some form of ancestor cult and belief about the dead is coextensive with humanity as such. This is such an important line. I'm going to make a video that's going to be much more organized than this, I hope, on the communion of the saints, right? And because um, yeah, when it comes to Protestant Catholic apologetics. But this is a crucial point, which is that what he's saying here is that our relationship to the departed, right, can be evil and superstitious, and or it can be purified with the right perspective, right? But what's for certain is that uh, this relationship is something that's like part of human nature. And we all know it, right? Even people, even our dearly beloved Protestant friends, right? Uh, talk in a way where I know she's watching over me. She still lives within my heart, and there's all this language, right? Um, and so he says here, some form of ancestor cult and belief about the dead is coextensive with humanity as such. This is so important for so much of his theology. Here, by coextensive, think of the Venn diagram, and in one circle of the Venn diagram, you have ancestor cult and belief. In the other circle, the Venn diagram, you have humanity. What he's saying is that these two Venn circles completely overlap. But he gets into ancient Israel and the way they actually naturalized death and cut off ancestor cult in a very fascinating way for very fascinating reasons that leads towards very fascinating conclusions. But we can't probably talk about that in this video. Okay, he concludes this section with, as the ancient historian Johann Jacob Bachofen, I don't know how to pronounce that, put it, it is down streets of graves that we make our way into the past. Okay, let's continue. This shared view of all early cultures, according to which only this life is really life, whilst death is being suspended in nothingness, was everywhere superseded as man's final word on the matter in the course of his own spiritual evolution. So we're now in the second phase. We talked about this first phase of the idyllic, community, the cycle of life, the myths that come from this, living on in your children, right? But then man evolves, right? Spiritually speaking, right? He evolves, and this is the rise of the individual and the kind of self-assertion, right? To not put up with the status quo, to step beyond the community, right? And to not accept things the way they are, and to rebel against the gods, right? And this is where Homer comes in, and this is why you should, and you have to read Homer, right? The Odyssey and the Iliad, must reads. Continuing, when the unreflecting shelter of the tribal states collapsed and the individual stepped forth to claim his full personal identity, this view of things underwent a crisis. This happened everywhere, not least in Israel, though in different forms. A kind of primitive enlightenment in which being human is highlighted in a new way, right? This individuality becomes it's brought to the forefront in a new way. And here I love this part here. He says, only in this context can one understand the specific intention of Plato's thoughts. In Homer's human, let me reread that sentence because the emphasis was wrong. In Homer's human, all too human depiction of the gods, there is a touch of irony and a suggestion of rebellion against the peevish caprices of the higher powers. So what he's saying is like if you read the Iliad, if you especially, oh man, anyway, in the Odyssey, like the pettiness, right? The capriciousness of the gods, it's kind of like he's mocking them a little bit, right? It's a subtle rebellion against the gods. It's this enlightenment in a certain sense, right? Of Odysseus stepping forth and sticking it to the gods, quite frankly, right? And the individual here breaks convention, right? And so he continues. In Greek tragedy, this incipient revolt is actually declared. The tragedians, I hope that's how you say it, right? The tragedians' Deus ex machina gives dramatic form to a contestation or denial of the actual world and its gods. So, for those of you who don't know, Deus ex machina is an expression which which means uh, an unexpected intervention that saves you from an otherwise hopeless situation, right? And so the Deus ex machina theme, right, in these ancient tragedies, these ancient Greek tragedies, is basically like so, the hero is like, all this bad stuff is happening. Like think of Oedipus, right? Like, you're going to kill your dad, marry your mom, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so he's like, well, I'm leaving my parents, right? But turns out they weren't his parents, and him leaving his parents means that he lands right where his real parents are and kills his dad and marries his mom, has no idea, and then realizes it, and then he's like, well, I'm screwed, right? Like fate has screwed me, and there's nothing I can do about it, right? Deus ex machina is like when you have this play, and like right when things are like the worst, something happens at the end of the play, and like the hero is good to go, right? He's vindicated, all his sufferings are gone, and it's unrealistic, right? But what it is like is the Greeks basically saying like, look, everything is crap, right? This is the status quo, and like we don't want it to be that way. So we'll have the Deus ex machina thing where it isn't that way at the end, right? But it's like contrived. But it is this kind of contestation or denial of the actual world and its gods, as Ratzinger puts it. So he continues: Were they were they truly divine, the gods, right? They would intervene as saviors and establish justice in the city, not be petty and like, you know, uh, I don't know. Just I mean, just think of the battles in front of Troy in the Iliad. The gods are like, deciding what to do. Let's make them win a little bit more today. Let's make them win a little bit more today. There's this like pettiness to the gods, right? And here the tragedians are saying like they were really gods, like they'd save us. They wouldn't be childish, right? And so anyway, so it's all a criticism of myth. Okay. He says such attitudes, thus anticipated in a mythopoeic worldview, took on the explicit expression of a rational critique in the work of the sophists. So this is the next step, right? So like uh all this stuff that's fomenting in Homer and in the tragedians, right? It just kind of bursts out in the form of rationalism, which is all this stuff is nonsense. All these gods, all this myth, it's all nonsense. Now, although that's true, like just think of the upheaval, the instability that ensues from such a revolution, right? This is where Plato steps in. This is where Aristotle steps in. But let's keep reading. So those attitudes also generated a program for human emancipation from the traditional powers that be. What took the place of the latter was natural law. So natural law here is not what we think yet. So bear with me. Let's hear out Ratzinger. What took the place of the latter was natural law, understood, however, simply as the right to self-assertion or of the stronger party. Okay, so when we think of natural law, we think of like the inherent like reasonableness of creation, right, of the world, and like Um, and natural law is like that which has to do with the flourishing of created essences, right? And so natural law is a moral norm because morality has to do with man's flourishing as a human being. And so it's part of natural law to avoid evil and do good, right? So it's this rational thing, natural law, right? But here, what Ratzinger is saying is that what took the place of all of this petty, mythological religion stuff and the bursting out of the individual to free himself from the pettiness of the world and the gods, because nothing is fair. You have this kind of teenage, like angsty, growing up happening. So, what took the place of the latter was natural law, right? And this natural law was it's pure will and pure strength, right? Against the face of the pettiness of the gods, right? The rights to self assertion of the stronger party. So he says this development was to some extent prefigured in the Homeric figure of Odysseus. Um, he continues, but when trust is being, sorry, but when trust in being and community is undermined in this way, and the individual's own advantage becomes the only lodestar the bonds of community cannot hold. So he's saying here, like, so Odysseus is breaking free from the tyranny of the gods and the tyranny of the safe haven, and everything's nice and dandy in the polis and the community, and his individuality is breaking forth, right? And that individuality as the law of freedom, right? This law of power, right, is like his guiding star. But like that creates a massive crisis in Hellenistic culture, right? And so here he says the spiritual crisis of the 5th and 6th centuries before Christ was also the political crisis of ancient Hellas, right? And I mean, part of it, like this is part of what the Iliad and then the Odyssey is, right? The Iliad is like this upheaval, and then Homer kind of emerges as like this stick it to the gods hero, right? It's kind of cool, to be honest. There's a reason why we still like it, right? Um, okay. Continuing. Um, it was to this crisis, at once political and spiritual, that Plato and Aristotle tried to respond. Not by turning back the wheel of history and putting together again the broken pieces of the world of myth, but in a way that might lead to a new future. So, how do they do this? This is the next step, right? I love his way of schematizing this. He does it in Truth and Tolerance as well. Um, the book about world religions. It's really fascinating. Um, okay, let's go. Let's hear Plato's what Plato does about this. So Plato and Aristotle, they entered into the spirit of the Enlightenment, right? The Greek Enlightenment, drew on the procedures of the sophists, right? But right, tried by this very means to find anew those guiding powers which make community possible. So they want to restore stability. Plato, taking his inspiration from Socrates, set over against the natural law of the strong and the cunning. Whoops, I misread that. Sorry, guys. Let me reread that. Plato, taking his inspiration from Socrates, set over against the natural law of the strong and the cunning a natural law of being itself, wherein the individual finds his place in the whole. So one way I'd explain this is that you got this circle, okay? And the individual's in it, okay? And enlightenment is like this breaking apart. The individual emerges from the circle, right? And it's like stick it to the gods, stick it to society, stick it to everyone, right? It's like, discovery of the self, right? You got this things aren't fair, like the suffering, the pettiness of the gods, and this discovery of the individual that happens in the Greek Enlightenment, right? He breaks free from this circle and everything is destabilized. So what does Plato do? He draws a larger circle. He goes deeper, right? And so he doesn't want to take the individual and put him back in his place in the polis in the community, but he wants to to create a vision of reality that grounds the political and the individual without while moving along with this enlightenment, right? And stabilizing the consequences of this enlightenment. So let's hear how he does this, right? So let's reread that last sentence. Plato, taking his inspiration from Socrates, set over against the natural law of the strong and the cunning a natural law of being itself, wherein the individual finds his place in the whole. Taking up the concept of natural law, he interprets it not in an individualistic and rationalistic way, right? Like people criticize Plato of being this up in your mind, all about ideas, not the body, not like lived experience, but just ideological thinking systems, philosophy. This is what people say, right? So he says, taking up the concept of natural law, he interprets it not in an individualistic and rationalistic way, but as the justice of being, which grants to the individual and to the whole their possibility of existing. So he grounds the very being of the individual and of the community, which had been destabilized, in justice itself, right? And he unfolds this. Here it says, for Plato, so in other words, let me just say this real quick. The natural law before Plato that you kind of find emerging in Homer is this law of the strong individual who sticks it to the gods, right? But that's destabilizing. So what does Plato do? He doesn't say, be obedient to the gods. The gods are great. No, like Plato's a critique. He's a critic of the gods. Just read Plato for 5 seconds, right? What he says is that not the gods, but justice itself is the law. So not the gods and not the individuals like, rebellion against the status quo, but what's right and just, right? What's right and just. It's a perfect solution, right? Because it counters this pettiness of the gods, and it also counters the destabilizing force of the ego of the individual, right? So he says here, for Plato, what is important is that. Oh, did I miss something here? Yeah, let me reread the last sentence. So, taking up the concept of natural law, he interprets it not in an individualistic and rationalistic way, but as the justice of being, which grants to the individual and to the whole their possibility of existing. For Plato, what is important is that justice is truth, and so reality. The truth of justice is more real than mere biological life or individual self assertion. So he grounds this on the law of justice, but he says this law is more real than Odysseus's self affirmation, right? Of his independence, of his biological life, of his individuality. And he says here, in comparison with justice and truth, mere biological existence appears as outright unreality, a shadow cast by the real, whereas the person who lives by justice lives by the really real. So justice is beyond the biological, but it makes the biological possible, the survival, right? Because if you have a instability and the individual declares his own ego, well, then things begin to implode. I mean, just look at us today, right? And that will destroy the individual. Look at abortion, look at euthanasia, right? And so he's saying what grounds biological, it's probably not a good topic to bring up in light of the Republic, but the point though is his insight here is fundamentally correct, right? Which is that if you ground the biological in something beyond the biological, that is what makes the biological possible in the first place. But if you don't, and you ground the biological in the individual bios, you might say, then you're going to lose it, right? Okay, kind of heady stuff. Let's see what we're looking at. Okay. All right. So we're going to start here at this paragraph right here, and we're going to scroll down to the end right here. Okay. He continues, such a thought provides a fresh foundation for politics and so a new possibility for the polis as community. At the same time, Plato gives it a grounding of a religious kind. In developing this insight by reference to religious tradition, he wishes to identify primordial springs of wisdom, which may take the place of the shallow religiosity of the by now faded myths. The philosophical martyrdom of Socrates belongs in this context. It is both a political martyrdom and a testimony to the greater degree of reality to be found in justice, as opposed to simply biological existence. These reflections appear to be taking us far from our theological problem. Nevertheless, and here's the key, here's the kicker, they are necessary. They show how untenable is that caricature of Platonism on which many current theological stereotypes depend. The real goal of Plato's philosophy is utterly misconceived when he is presented as an individualistic, dualistic thinker who negates what is earthly and advocates a flight into the beyond. Bingo. It's just so convincing. It's like empirically provable, right? If you look at the history, Plato's entire project is literally the opposite of this individualistic flight from the political, right? Flight from the polis, from the community, right? As you see in the Gnostics, right? It's oh man, yeah, it's kind of obvious, right? The goal of Plato's philosophy, right, is utterly misconceived if it's presented as an individualistic, dualistic thinker who negates what is earthly, right, and advocates a flight into the beyond. His whole point is to ground the earthly that is in crisis. I mean, that's why it's called the Republic, right? His aim is political. It's political philosophy, which he grounds in in metaphysics, right, in the good and the ethics that flows from this metaphysics, justice particularly, which structures the polis, and leads it towards its common good, which ensures its survival and its peace. So he's not this caricature. So let's continue and unfold these observations. The true fulcrum of his thought is the new ground of possibility for the polis, a fresh foundation for politics. His philosophy finds its center in the idea of justice. It developed in a political crisis and derives from the conviction that the polis cannot stand wherever justice is something other than reality and truth. The recognition of the living power of truth, which includes the thought of immortality, is not part of a philosophy of flight from the world, but is in an eminent sense political philosophy. These are insights which remain fundamental for an evaluation of contemporary political theology and political eschatology. If these movements do not confront the problem of death in its relation to justice at that level of depth which Plato opened up for us, they can, in the end, only obscure the heart of the matter. So he's showing the relationship between the question of immortality, of ethics, of politics, right? And how Plato found a synthesis that worked. But even in Plato's synthesis, right, the political is ensured its survival by reference to something meta-political that is not political, but beyond politics. And that is Plato's metaphysics, right? Justice, political ethics, right, is in fact the criterion of truth itself and therefore of reality, which goes beyond, right? The political is like a shadow, and it's grounded in truth itself, in reality itself, right, in the good, and that's why he stabilizes, right? The political landscape, you might say, in ancient Hellas, right? Which is, it was falling apart because of the disintegration of myth and the rise of the sophists, right? And then the poets, Homer especially, and the tragedians. Okay, here he writes, continuing with Ratzinger's text: if we try to capture the core of Plato's discovery, we can formulate it by saying that man, to survive biologically, must be more than bios. Here's the dualism coming in, right? But in a paradoxical way. He must be able to die into a more authentic life than this. The certainty that self-abandonment for the sake of truth is self-abandonment to reality and not a step into the night of nothingness is a necessary condition for justice. But justice is the condition on which the life of the polis endures. In the final analysis, therefore, justice makes possible biological survival itself. It's a beautiful syllogism there, right? I want to read something by Pieper before we close, but we're almost at the end here. So let's just finish here, Ratzinger's text. When we turn to consider directly the questions of the immortality of the soul and the resurrection of the dead, we shall have to discuss the mythopoeic and political instruments whereby Plato chose to express these insights. It will then become plain to what degree Christian faith had to intervene here, correcting and purifying. There is indeed a profound divergence between Plato and Christianity. Yet, this should not blind us to the possibilities of a philosophical unfolding of the Christian faith, which Platonism offers. These possibilities are rooted in a deep affinity on the level of fundamental formative intention. And that's his point here, right? Plato's intentions, in fact, are so similar to Moses's. Just think of the great story of Moses, of the Exodus. He gathers the people of God, Israel. This is the birth of the nation of Israel, right? By mediating at Sinai a covenant with God himself. And here God for Israel is construed as two things. Construed as life itself and as relationality itself. And, that's a different conversation. We could talk about that. But my point, though, is that it's similar. It's not identical, but it's similar to what Plato does. Plato stabilizes the political sphere in ancient Hellas by grounding the polis in the good through the virtue of justice. This is why the Book of the Republic is so important. It's if you haven't read the Republic, you're wrong. It's not a hard read. I strongly recommend anyone read it if you haven't read it. I'm joking. If you haven't read it, you're not wrong, but read it. So the intentions of Plato and the intentions of Moses are the same intentions. Again, they're not identical, but this hermetically sealing off Greek from Hebrew, it's nonsensical, historically. The similarities are actually pretty staggering if you consider the relationship between logos and chokmah. You have polis and what's the word for assembly? I can't remember. Anyway, you have a similar Hebrew word. Shoot, what was it? It's really important. I covered it in ecclesiology. Anyway, okay, so that is Ratzinger. Okay, let's end. I know it's an hour and 14 minutes. Let's end with Pieper here, because look, I think Plato obviously needs Christianity. He needs to be purified, right? Obviously, right? And I'm sick of the distortions of the kind of popular Plato that's like this individualist, right? That's like this rationalist antibody, let's get out of here kind of Like that's just not Plato. All right, let's read Pieper here. He's got some great stuff. And Pieper is like the guy to go if you want a good intro to St. Thomas. Um, I cannot recommend Joseph Pieper enough. Like, definitely buy one of his books and sit down and read it. You'll see what I mean. They're short, they're brilliant. It's going to enrich you. There's nothing to lose, and they're cheap, right? There's nothing to lose. Go buy some Pieper. Okay, this is on page 40 of his book Divine Madness. I'm trying to find the right place to start here. Just a second. Okay, so Pieper writes here. He's quoting from Phaedrus, which again another dialogue you should read. Thus do I begin my demonstration, we read in Phaedrus. Every spiritual being is immortal. End quote. The things we are familiar with do not prepare us for Plato's notion of immortality. This is Joseph Pieper, which refers not only to the future, but to the past as well. The human soul, this is his meaning, is not only without end, but also without beginning, agenetos in Greek. We are wont to disregard this idea, for it appears alien to us and outside our customary thinking, as something above all, incompatible with the Christian and Western concept of the human soul. And yet, does not the Christian doctrine, in the end, agree with this Platonic notion? We, too, conceive of the spiritual soul as something that, strictly speaking, does not become. The theological teaching that the human soul, like every spiritual being coming into existence, is directly created contains without doubt the correct insight that, unlike everything else, which develops and unfolds, the soul does not actually originate. A genesis of the soul would be inconceivable. That's exactly what Plato's saying, and that's what we believe. This thesis, by the way, tells us Pieper, has a direct contemporary relevance. It does not merely approximate Plato's concept. It obviously expresses the very same thought. This sameness is being underlined here, not for the purpose of forcing it into some modern pertinency, but in order to prevent the contemporary student of Plato from thinking that such reading exercises, perhaps dealt with to the point of weariness, are by now only of historical interest, and hence no longer relevant. Plato's genius manifests itself in the very fact that his insights cannot easily be dismissed, even though their verbal expression may seem questionable. They have kept their relevance, and we are unable to replace them with insights more pertinent. So, in other words, let's go back to Plato. Read Plato, understand him. There's some good stuff out there, excellent stuff out there. I mean, David Schindler has a book on Plato that is very difficult, but probably the best work on Plato out there. Okay, so here Pieper continues. The same applies to Plato's philosophical dictum that the natural habitat of the soul is the universe of all that exists. Even though we do not appropriate Plato's formulation that the soul, quote, reigns throughout the entire cosmos, end quote, we cannot, on the other hand, bring ourselves to understand and describe the spirit as anything but an essence whose nature includes existing within the universal horizon of all there is. Quote, to be endowed with spirit, end quote, means especially this, to be dealing with all there is. As Thomas Aquinas formulated it, the nature of this spirit is manifested first and foremost in its convenire cum omniente, affinity with all that is. Plato tried to gain some insight into the primordial accidents and fates that befell the soul by employing several illustrations, which, in the end, all bring out the same idea, that man has lost through his own offense, the perfection originally reserved for him as part of his supernatural destiny, and that, in consequence, he is now incessantly chasing after the original ideal form. The primordial condition, being at the same time the true goal and end of human existence, constitutes the object of man's remembrance as well as his longing. However, both remembrance and longing can unfold only if man, be it ever so briefly, leaves behind the busyness of his activities and steps outside the concerns of his workaday world. And so, finally, we shall speak of Eros, the erotic mania, the basis, the basic form of man's being beside himself, occurring specifically in his encounter with sensual beauty. For beauty, specifically physical beauty, if man approaches it receptively, can affect and strike him more than any other value, can push him outside the realm of his familiar and controlled environment, outside his neatly explained world, in which he deems himself rather confidently at home, as Rilke puts it. Anyway, so that my point though ultimately is that this body soul language, the immortality of the soul, and the idea of remembrance, and yeah, these are profound insights that are compatible with our faith. Of course, not all of Plato is, as Ratzinger pointed out, and as well, I'll probably make some more videos on this topic, and we'll get into like, okay, what's problematic with Plato, right? Um, but it's really sometimes a semantic thing and a kind of a really oversimplified view of Plato, which is not just a simplification, but even like a betrayal of Plato, actually. And like, why is it so popular? I don't know. Like even just in philosophy, like it's so popular that Plato is this idealist. Well, I mean, this individualistic, like, flight from the body, and anyway, you know, uh, dualist, like radically dualist. Okay, what's this line here? This is from, he doesn't say, but few there are who remember the sacred things they once beheld. It's a beautiful line. I think it's from Phaedrus. Okay, but there's one line I wanted to close the stream with. It's been an hour and 23 minutes. Okay, I'll leave you guys with this. Actually, before I read it, the whole point of this video, because as you'll notice, I haven't really talked about Moses because I don't really need to. Everyone knows the story of the Bible. Everyone knows the New Testament. At least people who are watching this, right? It's Plato who's been treated, who's being treated not very fairly. So I'm showing how Plato is compatible with the Moses that everyone knows to a certain extent. And so that's the point, really, which is there's a lot of problems that ensue if we do this weird and anachronistic and not really commonsensical like move to say that the Greek is like this very specific thing in a jar over here, and that the Hebrew is this very specific thing in a jar over here, and like if when the two meet, that's bad, and when they don't meet, that's good, because the Hebrew is pristine, it's uncorrupted, and the Greek is always a corruption. It's not authentic, and it's not concerned with our world. It's this flight into fancy, all that stuff is baloney. So that being said, there is like an idea of flight in the sense of like being beyond oneself, right? Leaving oneself behind. But that's like the idea of sacrifice and of death to self in order to receive oneself again, right? So again, it's just things are not that simple, right? And there's this idea of inspiration, which is tapping into something that is not originated from ourselves, precisely because we become ecstatic. We stand outside of ourselves. We leave ourselves behind. But that's that upward motion is made possible by a downward motion, right? Which is beauty in the world of the visual strikes us, right? And so it's never a leaving behind of things in an individualistic sense, but um, a loss of self, a flight into the good that truly grounds actually ourselves and gives ourselves permanence in, as Ratzinger put it, in the memory of God. Right? We talk about remembrance, or the remembrance of God. That's the source of our resurrection. But that'll be for another video. So I will end with this. Only those who open up to remembrance will be shaken to their core. Like gentle rain passing through the windows of the eyes, beauty prompts the soul to sprout wings again, to soar to the dwelling of the gods from where the soul originated. You'd think this would just be a quote that Pieper is quoting from some Greek tragedian or something. Nah, that's straight up Pieper. He wrote that. So get some Pieper books. This is Joseph Pieper, Divine Madness, Plato's Case Against Secular Humanism. All right, that'll be enough for today on Plato and Moses and how Plato's often misrepresented, but his intentions are very much so aligned with Moses's intentions. So if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure you like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. And if you want to support me, you can go to patreon.com/the Logos Project and check out my website for some classes or for some articles and the podcast episodes. Everything can be found there. You can reach out to me if you have questions or concerns, or you want to give me some money, whatever you want. That's where you can find me. So without further ado, we'll see you all next time. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and God bless.